Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome to VUX World, the Voice User Experience and Strategy podcast. Today's episode, and I say this every single time I do an intro, but today's episode is super exciting because we're speaking to Will Hall, the Executive Creative Director, and Jason Herndon, the VP of Engineering at Rain Agency. Rain are responsible for some of the big ticket skills, some of the ones that are always cited in all of the examples that you see of well-played brand skills, the Campbell's Soup skill, the Tide skill. They work with Warner Brothers to create the Dunkirk skill, which we spoke about with Florian Holland in a previous episode. They've created the Reverb app, which lets you test Alexa skills or access Alexa from your mobile. This agency is a big-time agency, and the two people we're speaking to today, our two guests, Will and Jason, are big-time voice creatives and technologists. So today's episode is going to be all about what it means to have a voice agency. What does a voice-first agency do? And as a brand, should you enlist one? As a UX designer or a developer, would you want to work for one? How does it all work? What kind of services do they offer? How do they go about designing and developing skills? How do the creatives and the developers work together? What industries and verticals are they seeing voice being applied in? What have they worked on in the past? What's worked? What hasn't? What have they learned? What's their process? We're going to get really into detail about all of that stuff, and we're going to do that right now. It's been absolutely roasting. I found out there, Jason, that 100 degrees Fahrenheit is 37 degrees Celsius, which is far hotter than it's ever been over here. So you must be absolutely baking over there.
Yeah, we're getting close. I think it's probably around maybe like 30 Celsius on average now. So, but it's like slowly ticking up. So we're just like the frog in the pot waiting for it to get bad, you know?
Yeah. What about over there where you are, Will? Is it piping hot?
Yeah, it actually is really hot. And, our office is actually pretty far west in Manhattan. And every time I get to the office, I'm just apologizing for my due. I'm just look like I took a bath. So I'm going to keep it classy for your podcast. So.
Yeah, nice. My office is literally, it's like south facing. So the sun starts shining through the window at about kind of like 9 in the morning, and it doesn't stop. It still hasn't stopped yet. So it's literally on. You can see the sun shining on me now. It's just absolutely piping all day. I need to get a blind fitted or something. But anyway, Jason Herndon and Will Hall, welcome to the VUX World podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Absolutely.
Thank you for joining us. It is an absolute pleasure. Rain Agency is one of the kind of agencies that as soon as anyone starts looking around in this space, very, very quickly do you come across Rain Agency. It is literally, correct me if I'm wrong, is it the leading voice-first agency in America? One of them?
Yeah. I mean, we definitely believe so, humbly but factually. I mean, we've just been in a very fortunate space to be able to have a lot of exposure. We were really early on, on both Amazon and Google's platforms. We had one of the first, if not the first, properly branded skill. And it really moved business for the company, that being Campbell's, that we worked with. And we just kind of early sort of started to carve out this niche. And it's been something we've been compounding on over time. We've really doubled down on voice. I mean, we've now worked with 35 of the Fortune 100 companies. And so, yeah, it's something we're really proud of, and it's become not just a thing we do, it's kind of become the focus of what we do. And it's something we're incredibly excited about.
Wow. Fantastic.
Yeah.
So is that the predominant kind of function of the agency now then? It's predominantly voice as opposed to anything else?
Yeah, and I would also sort of put a caveat around that. Voice meaning capital V, voice, right. Not just skills or just actions or just, but really thinking about the transformative nature of this new behavior and new technology. I mean, as you know the stats, so I mean, I'm not going to go through the stats of it all, but just the fact that in 2 years, half of all search is going to be done through voice. That's not just a skill or an action challenge. It's an everything action. It's an everything challenge. And so, a lot of what Rain is doing is helping brands not just make those smaller applications, but thinking about what does a voice first strategy look like. And then we build the ecosystem in support of that. And, so it's not just one thing, it's kind of everything. And one of the biggest talk tracks, frankly, one of the biggest challenges we have is a thing that people tend to ask us for, which of course we're happy to help with. But usually the first question is not the most important one. They'll say, oh, we need a skill, and we love skills and we're all about it. But that's not really the right question. It's how can we use voice as a new behavior to be integrated into our ecosystem to move our business in a meaningful and measurable way. And so, I head up the creative, and I'll certainly pass it to Jason, but Jason really oversees the technology. And, we have strategy, creative, and engineering really working in lockstep to help navigate voice and make compelling experiences.
Fantastic. Wicked. So, Jason, do you want to give us a bit of an overview of what you do at Rain Agency, and maybe it's kind of how you got into the whole kind of voice thing?
Yeah, absolutely. So really kind of oversee the production of all of our engineering projects, but specific to voice, making sure that the kind of the production of the voice applications happens. Part of that is, as we take each voice skill that we produce for brands, making sure that the kind of from the voice design all the way through testing and certification happens and is built. And then along the way, we've built a open source platform called Voxa to help developers, in the actual coding and building of these experiences. So most of our energy goes to, being able to build conversational experiences for these brands. And then also as we do that, looking for ways to kind of help the community and build out the platform that we've built.
Cool. Wicked. And what about you, Will? What's kind of your role, and what do you spend your time doing at Rain?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's funny because, my official title is Chief Creative Officer. And inevitably, whenever you tell somebody that at a party, and you're never at parties, by the way, if you're a chief creative, you never get invited anywhere if you're a chief creative officer. But 3 Mississippi later, they're saying, well, what's that mean? And it's a really good question. In a traditional advertising world, I think a creative director's job is to bridge the gap between strategy and creative. You make sure that all the great insights that the strategy team does is sort of executed and realized in the creative work that's made. And I think that most good creative directors are always thinking in systems. Campaigns are sort of a first discipline. You're always looking to make sure that any suite of creative outputs are working together as a family. And so as we've matured into voice, there is no bigger system challenge than voice. Everything is affected by voice. And so what I'm really doing is still bridging that gap between strategy and creative, but making sure that all these different disparate parts within an ecosystem that's being fueled by voice is working together. And also making sure that it's human. This technology, terms you hear often is this sort of idea of a crawl, walk, run. We know that this technology is growing exponential. The adoption is exponential. The capabilities are exponential. And I'm super excited about that, by the way. When you see something like the duplex, thing that came out, a couple of weeks ago, this was a sort of leapfrog moment where I feel like everybody's like, oh my gosh, that's what that could become? Holy cow. And I think that's the nature of these exponential technologies, is they hit an inflection point where all of a sudden you're saying, that's kind of cool. And then the next thing you know, like, oh my gosh, we need to start over. This is, transformative. And so for me, as a creative director, I'm constantly thinking about what is currently there, but I'm also trying to figure out how can we skate to where that puck is going? How can we make sure that when that transformative inflection point happens, that we're creatively postured to sort of capitalize on it? And there's a lot of brands right now that I think are taking a wait and see posture. Friend, they're going to be well behind, and that's not a scare tactic. It's a statement of fact. It's just the nature of this exponential growth and expansion of voice. And, so from a creative direction, just making sure that we're future ready and that this technology is wrapped with humanity. It's just so easy to make this tech that I love. I'm a nerdy guy. I love widgety things, but it's easy for that stuff to kind of get in the way of what actually lives where people live. And when you think about voice being our natural interface, it should feel human. It should feel emotional. It should feel, again, as natural as me talking to you. And so how can we allow the technology to enable that instead of getting in the way of it?
Cool. That sounds...
I was going to say that, we're lucky to have creative strategy and engineering all in the same house, but we've orchestrated it that way just to kind of to put a pin in Will's thought on systems, because, making these interactions at all, but making them well and making them human, making them something that connects with people is an exercise of all three of the sides of Rain. From a creative standpoint, how do we make it human? But that's also a technical problem, and it's also a issue as well in terms of, how human do you want to make them or not. So I love that we get to kind of, work in all of that environment. And it's not something that I think that a lot of other agencies or shops out there get to be able to do, to have, a creative who owns the strategy for a brand, who sits down next to someone who is building the thing, and get to be able to build these experiences. And I think the kind of the quality and the craft of what we're able to itself there.
Yeah. So how closely do you two work together then, typically?
I would say very closely. Rain, we have an internal mantra of one company in 3 offices. We have offices, here in New York and in Central America, Utah, and we actually have opened a satellite there in Seattle, given all the work we're doing with Amazon. And so it's just, we're constantly collaborating, in the same way that we are right now with this podcast, and it's something that's sort of always been in our DNA and something we continue to do. But it's so funny because everything benefits from collaboration, typically, but boy, oh boy, when it comes to voice, is that ever more the case, Any thoughts on that, Jason?
Yeah, I think that, there are other mediums that we could work in where collaboration and working together is, would improve the project. But for voice specifically, I think it's just a necessity. I don't know how you do it in a distributed way when you're not communicating and talking with each other. I mean, the voice design process is both let's chart out and map how we want this skill to go. And then as a developer builds it, it's kind of like, oh no, that word comes out wrong from Alexa. Let's go back and redo that word, or let's go back and re-architect that flow or something. So I think voice is just by nature, it has to be, just as we sit down and we have a conversation together, and it's 2 or 3 people who are having a conversation, building the conversation takes, a similar team of 2 or 3.
Yeah. So it sounds from what you were saying in terms of when you're involved in client work and whatnot, you would have technical and creative involved all through from beginning to end. Is that right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, and strategy, and it's those are really the 3 pillars of our business. And it's funny because I think, again, humbly but factually, you mentioned in the beginning how Rain has sort of been sort of the leading voice company, and we do humbly agree with that. But I think one of the reasons why is we have, I think, very, very capable tech folks. I think we have very capable creative folks, but we've been linking all of this stuff to business drivers. And, though it's so funny because innovation with a lot of companies is sort of somehow oddly synonymous with random. A lot of the first calls we get, I say this in a good spirit, but they're usually just kind of throwing stuff at the wall, and there's no real strategy there. But, we've really found that, guys, even though this is a new technology and a new behavior, and yes, very often it is an innovation play, it can move your business in a real measurable, profound way. And I always sort of have to point to, work we've done with Tide as an example. They were one of the first skills. But because they were there early on, they're really able to reap a lot of the benefits from voice, because something that a lot of brands aren't accounting for in the context of something like a skill or an action is, voice is this sort of 2-way, street, but it also listens. So we're able to figure out, brands exist in the minds of your consumers. So what comes to mind when Tide comes to mind? We created a skill that we programmed how to get rid of something like 35 stains. How do I get, grass out of sneakers or grass out of jeans? But we realized almost 10% of the things people asked us for were things that we didn't have products for. So things like, how do I get dirt out of sneakers? How do I get wine out of upholstery? They don't have sneaker products, nor do they have upholstery products. And so you just start to think about the qualitative difference of voice versus a Twitter feed. That's different. That's a focus group of 1 in a sense. And that's something really powerful to us. And so, you start to think about moving business. That's a valuable insight, and we can link that back to business drivers. And it's always something we're trying to ladder back to a business driver, even though it's new and innovative, should not be synonymous with random.
Yeah. So because Rain have worked on, as I said, some of the real kind of big hitting skills. You mentioned Tide there. Campbell's Soup was a really early one one as well, wasn't it? And then there's the Warner Brothers collaboration with the Dunkirk kind of skill. Lots of really kind of presumably relatively big budget, certainly headline grabbing. These skills are mentioned whenever you look for good examples. These come up all the time. And what I'm kind of curious about is you mentioned there around the strategic side of it and trying to link it back to business drivers. Let's take the Tide one, for example, you just mentioned there. Did that start out as that, as in Tide came to Rain and said, look, we want to try and enhance our business, gather more insight and all that sort of stuff? Or did they come, first of all, at a different place and you had to kind of guide them around? How did it all start in the beginning?
Yeah, that's a really good question. In the case of Tide, in all fairness, a lot of those insights they knew. In the case of Tide, they know that figuring out how to get rid of stains, that moves their business, and they have data to back that up. There's a reason their whole ecosystem is built around stain removal. So in theirs, it was, in fairness, pretty obvious. But when you look at something like you mentioned a second ago, our Campbell's work, that to us is sort of our C picture for good strategy when it comes to voice, because there was no strategy. They have strategy, but they didn't have what's that critical insight. And one of the ones that we found is that we were able to build a 5-year business case that said recipe views drive sales. And we were able to prove this empirically. And so when you start to say, well, gosh, what should our skill be? Well, we know what moves your business. And it's dinner recipes, specifically dinner. That's what moves your business. And so when you look at that first skill, everything, and in fact, their entire ecosystem that we helped architect and build, it's rooted not just in, random facts and here's an article and here's this other thing. No, everything is rooted in, how do I solve dinner? Dinner is what moves their business. Dinner is what consumers are looking for, and their ecosystem is set up to support that. And so, though, again, in some ways it seems somewhat obvious, before we came in, they didn't have that data. We came in and by the way, by leading with voice, you're able to get a lot of those insights a lot faster. I think when you think about, in 2 years, half of all search is going to be done through voice. Yes, okay, we agree. But the thing is that what that's forcing brands to do is actually own conversations and not just keywords. And when you think about the larger consumer trends of 2018, people aren't searching for brands anymore. In the case of Campbell's, people aren't looking for Prego, one of their brands. It's a tomato sauce. I mean, some people are, but most are not. But everybody's looking up, how do I feed a picky toddler? How do I make lasagna? And that's the conversations that they have they have the products and the category authority that they should be able to own those conversations. So it's really forcing brands to stop thinking from an inside out, Campbell's, Prego, then the consumer, but instead start with the consumer, get their conversations, and then get them to us. And it's, again, voice first is a really great way to, it almost implicitly makes you focus on the consumer first. And that's something that we tend to have some really nice insights around.
And then, so Jason, when kind of you're involved in this side, I mean, let's take the Campbell's, for example. You do a bit of work up front and you do that kind of business case analysis or what have you. You come up with a concept, and then obviously as a designer, the kind of designers will shoot for the stars, won't they? This is the ideal big picture. In an ideal world, this is how it works. Your involvement at that stage, is your involvement reining people back, or is your involvement, you still shoot for the stars and I'll try and kind of build it?
Yeah. We try not to have a lot of wet blankets around the office, because I think those aren't the type of things that create compelling and engaging interactions or with brands or experiences. The kind of the old paradigm of the same old thoughts or the same old processes are going to return the same old product. So we because we have been around the block for quite a while with this, we have a lot of super creative people who, at the same time, are very aware of the technical capabilities and understandings of the platform. They're not the people who are developing it, but they're aware of it. Same thing with our strategy folks. They're the same people who know the ins and outs of Amazon certification and the limitations there. But I would say kind of across the board, we all strive to challenge each other, to raise the bar on what's possible, and to keep just pushing that out further and further and further. I think, you mentioned the Dunkirk skill. That's a great example of what was a choose your own adventure game. We built a game engine for that inside of our Alexa skill. We used a lot of custom bespoke audio that was created. That was amazing and well produced, and weaved that into a graphic novel that's texted to the user. I mean, we pushed the boundaries in a lot of what was possible there and created something that was amazing. And I don't think that would have came about. To all of our team's credit, I don't think that would have came about if anybody at any point wasn't willing to kind of push the boundaries. Now, for sure, we definitely kind of sometimes reach limits that are kind of frustrating, or why does the system do that, or oh gosh, we've got to do a workaround there. But I think in general we do a good job as a team of kind of like leaning into those moments and not letting the limitations stifle creativity, but letting them actually drive it and say, okay, how can we make something really amazing with one hand tied behind our back? And that's a challenge that we enjoy and we're really up for,
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and I would also sort of add to that, I think Amazon has been a really great partner in that, because the thing I'm loving about voice in general is that everybody wants it to be great. And that's from us to the client to certainly the dev folks and Amazon and Google themselves. And, from Amazon, they're like, tell us what you want and let's figure out how we can build that. That's different. That's just a different posture, because we want to make this great and transformative, because it is. And, that's something that, and I think Dunkirk is such a good example of that. Like, a lot of that stuff was, you really had to kind of hot wire it to kind of make it all work together. But there was a collaborative spirit that we want to make this great. And that is an exciting posture to be in, where you're building the car while you're driving it. And we want it to be awesome. And it makes it an exciting space to be in,
Yeah. So Rain are obviously a kind of an Amazon partner, aren't they? So you obviously must work quite closely with Amazon. Do you work kind of like in that Dunkirk example? You were talking there around kind of the Amazon were really responsive and you managed to push the boundaries in certain areas. How does that kind of relationship work? Do you take an idea to Amazon and say, can you build that? Or is it more collaborative? Are they involved earlier? Kind of how does that relationship between you and Amazon work for the sake of pushing the technology forward?
Yeah, so just to be clear, we're definitely are friends with Amazon, and again, we're fans of them, but we also work with Google. We've spoken at Google as well. I mean, we're an advocate for our clients first and foremost, and we try to figure out how we can use those properties and companies to their ends. But, and so, yes, we do work collaboratively. In the case of Dunkirk, a lot of times it's just a couple of emails. Honestly, it's not so. It doesn't have to be much more than that. It's like, hey, can this be possible? Maybe if X, Y, and Z are true, can this get on the roadmap? But it's usually not much more than that. There have been occasions where we've actually helped them build some of their, working a little bit more there in Seattle, building out something, with them. But for the most part, it's a little bit more informal than that. I'll let Jason sort of elaborate on it if you'd like.
Yeah. I mean, I'd definitely second all of that. I think the thing that maybe I'd add would be that there definitely have been moments both with Amazon and Google, and I think anybody who's involved in this space, because to Will's point, I mean, everybody really wants to see amazing experiences get built, where we have had moments where we've kind of pulled together with, parts of their, technical teams or parts of their kind of product owners to kind of ask, kind of just gut check questions of, okay, what's possible today? What do we think is going to be possible? What type of experiences do you want to build? Is XYZ a limitation? Oh gosh, it is. Okay, yes. What could we do to kind of to move that forward on both sides? I think everybody's been really kind of interested in the behind the scenes of, how do these things get built, and so then therefore how can we help enable and drive forward the adoption of developers really getting into this, both from a feature set level or a documentation level. So yeah, I think everybody's been really kind of wanting to lean in and make sure that the process is as collaborative as possible. And that's been super helpful for us to be able to just know that there's no kind of pain point, or there's no limitation that's not on someone's map or radar somewhere. And so kind of just looking ahead in the next 2 or 3 years, we really do get to genuinely kind of say, like, it's going to be in an amazing place, and it's going to be something where, all of those kind of creative, those wildest dreams are a ton more feasible, because I think everybody's tracking the same way. And we've got the same kind of list of like, okay, like let's hit X, let's hit Y, let's hit Z, and then let's knock it out of the park in terms of what the platform's capable of. So I'm excited to see where it goes.
You've worked on Tide, worked on Campbell's, they're kind of more sort of consumer products. You've worked on Dunkirk, that's kind of like filmed content. What other, the people listening to this who might not have kind of taken the first steps into this industry yet, and I know there's a lot of brands that are interested in this space. So you've got the consumer goods side, you've got the kind of like content film production side. What other sort of industries and verticals either have you worked with or do you see opportunities in?
Maybe I can start that, and then we can and go from there. We work around. There's 6 verticals that we're really focusing on right now, and we're seeing obvious implications. And those would be CPG. No, CPG is trying to get into this. When you look at the disruptive nature of Amazon specifically, and how that sort of positions Zero. When you ask it to buy a product, it only gives you 1 or 2. There's a reason that CPGs are first to wait a minute, they're going to transact $11.7 billion in 2 years through voice. I need to figure this out right now. And so I think there's a reason, again, those brands were sort of first to it. But, when you look at healthcare, which is one of our verticals, hugely powerful, and especially when you consider the adoption of the elderly community around voice. It's so funny because voice, very often tech adoption, there's sort of a bell curve of age and, let's call them millennials for lack of a better word, early adopters. And here, certainly they're adopting voice. But when you look at the opposite ends of the spectrum, young kids, older folks, they love voice. And when you look at somebody like, a 5-year-old kid, a lot of those kids are growing up with voice. It's just ubiquitous. It is an expectation that I can go to my YouTube Kids app and speak to it. They can't read, they can't write. This is just how they interact with stuff. And as a result, since, when you look at the entertainment vertical we work in, recently Alexa AVS became COPA compliant. So we launched a number of kid-based skills. Fundamentally different interaction, and it's something that really excites me. When you talk about the toxicity, I'm using air quotes around toxicity of screen time with kids, I think one of the problems is it breeds isolationism. It's like the kid is just in the room, but they're in a bubble. But voice all of a sudden makes it this conversational and communal thing, and it gets really exciting. And something else you realize is that adults, when we look at these devices, I see it as a device. I think a lot of people are playing. They use it for efficiencies. They're using it to call an Uber. They're using it to turn on the lights and things like this. But a kid actually tends to anthropomorphize the thing. And when you think about anthropomorphism, it invites play and exploration and what could be. And it's more of an improv situation in some sense. And I've just been incredibly excited about the transformative nature of voice being put on these technologies that are breeding isolation and depression are now with voice breeding community, collaboration, exploration, and joy. And then on the older sect, actually also fighting a lot of that isolation and things like that. But, certainly any industry that could benefit from the affordance of efficiency that voice brings, it's a no-brainer. Things like, Domino's and the Starbucks of the world, how, they are no doubt using voice to try and make it easier for you to order whatever your product is. That's a no-brainer. Working in the financial space. And when you think about how much speed has to do with investing. Voice is something we're actually working with some financial companies around that exact brief. How can we sort of use the affordance of voice to make it more efficient? So we're really seeing this, and by the way, you're seeing this in every vertical. How they're starting to mature to a place where voice can be an integral part.
Yeah, and I think it's answering the question. If you go back 5-10 years. How is a screen likely to impact education, or how is a screen likely to impact hospitality? It's hard to kind of undersell the impact of an interface on society in general, and of course on every different vertical that's out there. So for sure, voice is going to impact hospitality, both from a kind of a discovery and journey of creating and booking travel to a in-room experience at a hotel room. For sure, that's going to happen, and is a space that that we've been working in. So it's one of those, I think, because voice is going to be this ubiquitous interface that's going to find its way into every nook and cranny of our society. There's going to be, for every different vertical, at least one, probably 2, 3, 4 kind of those killer use cases of, okay, yeah, that's exactly how voice plays for this vertical. That's exactly how someone in a hospital room or someone who's at home asking questions about, how do I consume this drug or something. There's those use cases for every single industry. And so I think for us, it's just a matter of, okay, how do we find those, tap into those, and then work with brands that are kind of, at that leading edge who get it and really want to be able to take this to the next level and really kind of leverage exactly what this new interface is going to mean for their consumers.
Yeah, and the one thing I would add to that, by the way, is, one of the biggest challenges. We all know that like personalization is the buzzword of the day. I mean, everything's about personalization and recommendation and all this, and obviously that's going to vector to a place where a recommendation becomes anticipation, where things can act on my behalf. We kind of know this, right? But the idea of personalization, voice being able to solve the capacity problem of me talking to you. If within a voice assistant, now I can have an assistant talk to you, you can have your assistant talk to my assistant and things like this. And personalization is such a powerful tool for brands. And when you think about voice and voice assistants and the AI that's underneath it, being able to, again, scale the capacity of personalization, I also think that's something that has tremendous implications in pretty much any vertical you could think of.
Absolutely. You mentioned kind of across that hospitality. So obviously Amazon rather have released the kind of Alexa for hospitality kind of feature. I haven't looked too detailed into it, so I'm not 100% sure what it is, but presumably it's making it easier for any hotel owner to get themselves a presence on Alexa. I don't know if you've had any experience with hospitality, and also can you see, a bit of a double-barreled question, so maybe I'll split it up. Have you had any experience with the hospitality stuff? And then after that, can you see the same kind of thing happening in other industries where Alexa or Amazon can kind of take on some of that core functionality?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, hospitality is we've worked with a couple of leading brands in the U.S., both from a kind of a travel and destination and planning of a trip to the actual kind of a in-room experience at a hotel. I think one of the things that the Alexa for Hospitality and in general the Alexa for Business kind of additions to the Alexa suite give us is the ability to take what is for a consumer an at-home device that they use in their home for a brand to be able to put that in an office room or a hotel room and to allow anybody to be able to use that. So now it becomes a utility that hotels can manage in every room, and they can, with Alexa for Business, they can, provision 200 devices, assign those to every room. And then when someone says, oh, fetch my car, order me room service, I need more towels, they can know that, that request is coming from that room and it's routed to them. So it's this really powerful way for brands to be able to, specifically like in the hospitality space with in-room experiences, it's a really, really incredible way for them to be able to leverage these personal assistant devices at an enterprise level. And that's that right there is really the key. So if you think about anything that has an office space, a building, a room where there are lots of rooms and the enterprise or the business has a vested interest in understanding what's going on in those rooms or in fielding requests from those rooms, the possibilities are limitless. So for sure, in a few years, whether Amazon does it or Google does it or somebody else does, there's going to be, some kind of a voice for hospital rooms that has this. For sure, in the next few years, there's going to be a voice for classrooms in an educational space. Amazon already has the Alexa for Business that allows you to do that in office rooms and conference rooms. And so I think it's really kind of, when Amazon came out or the Alexa devices, came out as the first kind of really consumable voice speaker, we really saw it as a one-to-one kind of a relationship between the consumer in a room with that device. Now we're beginning to see the relationship of like a business having that room with the device and the consumer interacting with it. And at some point, I'm sure that we'll see a relationship of, many people in a room who are using it in the case of, hospitals or classrooms or universities or things like that. So we're just kind of pushing the boundaries on how these devices are being used. But those enterprise applications with Alexa for Business and hospitalities are going to be, I think we're 2 or 3 years away from, it being the place where every time you check into a hotel room, there is some kind of a smart speaker that lets you control the room or get information about the hotel or order room service or things like that. It's just going to be one of those no-brainers for hotels and anybody else.
Yeah, and I would also say that our central thesis on voice. When anybody asks us, you're in an elevator and they say, "What are your thoughts on voice?" We have one sentence on it. It is like, to win at voice, you have to think in systems. I know that's like a bumper sticker and a soundbite, but there's meat on that bone. It is a system problem, and the reason I say that is because when you ask, will Amazon, will Google start to create these industry and vertical specific offerings? I think absolutely. And also, I think that's also going to be part of the power of this. Even right now today, when you look at, how people are training various NLPs, natural language processing, around very specific occasions or verticals. Watson has a phenomenal healthcare NLP, so like you could imagine in the not too distant future where there might be some execution that's grabbing that for a specific case and grabbing this for a specific case. I'm actually a fan of like SoundHound, this sort of independent assistant. They have this thing called Collective AI, and it's very much architected. I'm not a tech guy, by the way. I'm sort of speaking conceptually as a creative, my understanding of it. But it's like, I'm going to own this specific little moment. This guy over here is going to own this specific moment, and all these little AIs can start to work together and be built a la carte for a specific case. I think that's just an interesting model. But when you look at sort of, various NLPs that are being created around specific cases, and even what Duplex, Google and Duplex did around specific occasions, like ordering, appointments and things like that, you can just start to see how these little moments can start to be stacked together to build certain interactions. I think that's super interesting. And I can't imagine that Google, Amazon, Microsoft, et cetera, surely they're going to continue to do that. They already are.
Yeah, I mean, the analog is what happened with web and mobile. I mean, the question isn't, Apple came out with an iPhone, so Samsung, hangs up the door and says, okay, guys, we're going home. I mean, that's not how it works. So for sure, there's going to be, competition across all of these smart speaker devices and the services that they offer. But at the same time, you see it with Google's cloud offering, how they have, healthcare specific cloud offerings, how they have educational specific offerings. Amazon's the same way, as is Microsoft. And then each of those have, the places where they're, really kind of tailored for very specific use cases. And so you're having, an air traffic controller who's running on an Azure cloud or something in Microsoft, and their systems are talking to other systems that are, orchestrating different things, and they're running on Google's. And so the way that we've seen web go in the last 10 years, where all of these computer interfaces just begin to talk to each other and have their own kind of like purpose fit, I think, to Will's point, that's exactly where we're going to be going in the next few years with voice, and each of them owning different domains and communicating and talking to each other in that way.
Yeah, and actually that leads us to, like, occasionally we're asked to sort of see, where do we see this stuff going? And when you start to think about the complexity that Jason, we were just talking about, where there's this thing over here, that thing over there, everything getting pulled together. I mean, even now you can talk to Cortana through Alexa and vice versa. I mean, we're going to end up at a point, and Mercedes, and their car has their own assistant that's talking to another assistant that's talking to another assistant. No more, and I think that in the not too distant future, I would hope that this stuff would vector to a place where the assistant is my assistant, and my assistant acts on my behalf and brokers those various interactions on my behalf. Because right now the voice assistance race is really voice forward, is company forward rather. You call Alexa, you call Google, you call Siri. Why? I mean, I want what I want when I want it. So let me just talk to my assistant and you go deal with that. And so I think that is the sort of, in my mind, the natural evolution of this sort of, system nested in other systems. I think that's the implication of it.
Yeah, there's, do you know Smartly.ai? Don't you come across Smartly?
I've heard of it. I'm not super familiar with it though. No.
So Hichem Tahiri, who is the CEO, they do the voice Smart Voice Summit, which is a really, really cool event. Actually, it's coming up in February. They just did one in London last month, and what they're trying to do is create a digital assistant alliance, which is hoping to start doing kind of just that. I think their vision is that, exactly what you said, why can't you just speak to an assistant, wherever that is, whether it's a smart speaker in a bus stop or in your shower head or on your phone, and be able to call upon any other assistant, whether it's Cortana or Alexa or whatever, and have them fulfill their function from wherever they are, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
All rolled up together.
It seems, I love that. I'm going to look more into that. I mean, it seems so counter to, voice is our natural interface. I think that's one of the reasons that, again, back to the older folks, very often they don't like technology, but they love voice. Well, why? Because it's our natural interface. There's that barrier to entry is very, very low for the most part. And so to sort of put a natural interface through layers of tech unnecessarily seems counter to the premise. And so, I love that kind of thinking, and I hope it really gets there soon.
Yeah. I think you're right in terms of, so I've told this story a few times, but my nana hates all technology, and she wouldn't even get a DVD player. I think she's still got a VHS player somewhere. And she came round, which is all right because I get to watch the young ones on VHS, which feels as though that's how you should watch young ones. But every time she come round a few months back, and we had an Echo in the front room. My mum was upstairs in this room, and I dropped in on my mum upstairs, asked if she wanted a cup of tea, and then went and put the kettle on. And then I was like, "What's all that about?" And I said, "Oh, it's just, it's a smart speaker. You can talk to it, and it does stuff and that." And she's like, "Oh no, I don't want that. I don't want technology. No, thank you." And then literally 2.5 hours later, I heard music blasting from the front room. I walked in, and my nana's going, "Alexa, play some Gordon Lightfoot." And she didn't need any instruction. She's just using it. You know what I mean?
Oh, that's great. Yeah. By the way, Gordon Lightfoot, strong listen from Nana there.
Yeah. So is that what you're talking about when you talk about systems thinking? Because when I seen it on the website, and we were kind of speaking beforehand with Mayan about what we might discuss and stuff, and we were talking about systems thinking, and what I thought was systems thinking was that as a company or as a brand, thinking about the systems that you use internally and how you can create a technology environment that would allow everything to operate seamlessly and talk to each other. Is that the right definition? Is that a wrong definition, first of all?
No, I think that's very much right. It's really what we call and. I mean, it's just everything. It's not, most Fortune 100 companies, their businesses are based in a very siloed, bureaucratic model. And by the way, I understand that. I mean, there's efficiencies there, but as a result, very often the right hand doesn't know what the left is doing. And again, when you think about voice, the way you win position 0, let's say in voice search, I mean, that's a web problem and a voice problem and the SEO problem and the SEM problem and. And so you really have to collaborate, together to make everything work as one cohesive system. And I also look at companies like Domino's, we kind of point to them very often where, they're such a good example of having discipline in their innovation. Yes, they're early adopters of pretty much every new technology. They're there sort of on day one. But, on day one, you can order pizza through their skill, which talks to their app, which updates my phone, which speaks to their store, and. And so everything is just everything else. And, the idea that we were talking about earlier about this sort of all these parts working together and, having a touch point that's meaningful to me, I just think that's a lot of what systems are about. How do I have one conversation with 1,000 chats? That continuity between touch points is I think the affordance of a really thoughtful digital ecosystem.
So when you're working with brands and you're kind of having that kind of approach, because when you take it up a level and you talk about Alexa speaking to Cortana or Google Assistant being able to interlink with Siri or whatever, that's very much something that we can't really control, can we? So when you're working with brands, are you predominantly talking about that last train of thought that you were talking about, having your Alexa skill, for argument's sake, interlink with your CRM or whatever?
Yeah, it's really a lot more that. That's exactly right. That's 100% right. And understanding, when, and understanding the context of those technologies. But that's 100% right.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That makes sense. Cool. We'll move on to discuss a little bit about, the kind of RAIN process and how you go about doing what you're doing stuff. But just to wrap up on the systems thinking, what are some of the sort of challenges that may exist within a company when it comes to systems thinking? Because I'm imagining that when we discuss it and we're kind of on a level sort of playing field in terms of understanding the value that might bring, I'm presuming that not every brand that comes to you is in the same kind of place. So what are some of the either challenges or some of the discussions that you need to have around that?
I mean, we call it lovingly the herding cats problem of these kind of giant holding companies. You're exactly right. I mean, that is the challenge 1, 2, and 3. You have a great meeting with the innovation team, let's say, but they're only, their domain is this big. But in order for us to actually win voice search, let's say, we actually need to talk to this team. They might not even know who that person is. And so you're 100% right. I think that's one of the biggest disciplines I would say that we at RAIN, we talk about our process. How do we infiltrate a place and get a team to work collaboratively and interdisciplinarily? And it's been something I will say, though, that though it's an obvious challenge and companies are not structured to do that at all, I will say that voice, for whatever reason, has for some reason, for whatever reason, has actually brought cross-functional teams at one table. So what has thankfully happened, at least here, over the last couple of years, is, we'll go into, a large holding company or what have you, and there's the innovation person, there's the SEO person, there's the digital person, CTO, CIO, CCO, whatever. And it's good because we actually have a larger presentation that shows them the capital V voice, not just skills, not just actions, but this is what voice is going to mean. And we've had a pretty good success rate of having them say, I got it. We kind of need to work collaboratively here. I got it. We kind of need to, in some ways, start over a little bit. And I'm actually, it's funny because I think the companies that stand to lose the most are those that are structured the worst to solve this. So I think they're the ones that need to be the most aggressive. When you think about the ones that are the most siloed, the most bureaucratic, very often they're easily commodified CPGs, and it's just like, guys, we're going to have to figure out a way to collaborate and think differently. You've got to make innovation not be this noun, this thing you do once over there in that corner office, but a thing that is truly imbued into every touch point, and all of us are working together. And I think they stand the most to gain and the most to lose, but they have to work together to do it. Back to systems.
Yeah. So it sounds very much then as though Rain as an agency and you chaps and the teams that you work with aren't necessarily strictly an agency in terms of you get a brief, you build something, you launch it and deliver it, but it sounds as though you're kind of working back up that kind of funnel and working within the organization, trying to help them understand how they need to structure the organization to make this stuff work.
It's really true. And if I may sort of add one thing to that, I think what tends to happen, and look, I came from an agency world. I love agency people. I get it. You know what I mean? I'm right there with you. But usually what happens when people give us an idea, they don't know the questions yet to ask. And that's not their fault. It's the nature of the technology. I mean, we live this stuff. We breathe this stuff. And, what tends to happen when you look at the history of technology and the history of media, what almost always happens is people negotiate the new with the old. They figure out what, and I think the best example of that would be something like TV. When TV came out, for about the first decade, the ads on TV were basically radio ads on TV, brought to you by, and they sounded like radio. They were run by radio people. And it was like, finally, I think it was a Chevy Malibu ad. All of a sudden they showed a car on the beach with a woman and they're revving, and you're like, oh my gosh, I can make movies on this thing. And they're starting to understand what TV did really well. And now you've got, the last 50 years of media. But the same thing has happened with the web, right? I mean, when the web came out, people were sort of putting it web pages. I mean, they were putting books on the web. They were negotiating the new with the now. And you can see this from a design perspective with skeuomorphic design. When mobile came out, Apple, I think, rightly used skeuomorphic design. Here's a physical TV to explain YouTube. Here's a notepad to explain notes. And the same thing happened with voice. A lot of the calls we get from agencies to go make my thing, they're very often taking a thing that is good for a website, but is not good for voice. They're trying to cram a website into a voice experience, and it is not at all the same thing. And so we're never negative on that, but we just try to take a respectful posture. Can we have a moment to talk to have some level setting? And we found that to be a very, good outcomes. The best work we've had have come from that. But it's a challenge. Usually when people just say, hey, can you just go make my skill? Here's X amount of money. We're usually not so excited about that. And those tend not to do great, bluntly, just because there's a lot to sort of get caught up to speed on.
I think where we found a lot of leverage or not leverage rather, but traction kind of partnering with people is, I think about kind of typical ad agencies as really kind of being concerned with the output of some kind of a creative or, development or some kind of a technical thing. And, it's not just that, we've developed ways of communicating with consumers that are kind of purpose fit for the modes in which we're communicating with them. Behind the scenes, we've developed like operational and internal structures and organizations and digital ecosystems that are all in support of whatever that thing is. So if it's radio ads, we have a team and a structure and an organization and a process that supports building radio ads. If it's websites, we have a web team and they work with the product people, and everything behind the scenes mirrors exactly how we're outputting. So of course it makes sense that if there's a new interface that you're actually interacting with consumers on, that's going to have implications for how you work together, what kind of teams you have, how you structure, what kind of roles do you need? Do you need need somebody who's a conversational analyst, and it's more than just someone who's, managing a Twitter page. You're actually interacting with consumers, and of course that person's going to be working with a product person to talk about how you talk about your product on your site, and that's going to have kind of implications across the board. So I think that's one of the things that we've been helpful with brands as well, is kind of caring about them as organizations kind of behind the scenes, and being able to kind of be partners with them, and to give them guidance, help, structure, services that kind of help them realize how exactly this new interface is going to just completely kind of rock their organization, for the consumer and behind the scenes too.
Yeah, and we would really encourage agencies as well to I was actually speaking with the folks at Pinterest recently, and they were talking about how a lot of times when agencies come to Pinterest, they're trying to break the platform. They're trying to say, here's what Pinterest does well. They're like, well, that's great, but can I put a movie on it? Well, kind of, yeah, sure, but that's not really what it does, or whatever the idea is. And I'm not poo-pooing those sort of, things that try to push a platform, but there's something more profound as opposed to pushing against it, to seeing how can I live in it? How can I sort of embody the affordances and limitations of this technology to make something really great and remarkable by its own rules? Creativity is born from constraints. And I think very often new agents, a lot of agencies who are new to this stuff, they try to basically say, well, forget the rules. I just want to make this thing. And you see this, early on, some creative awards that came out of that. And by the way, I get it. They're cool things, but they're throwing humor at it, because humor is it's easy to be the kid in the back of the bus throwing paper. It's hard to live in it and make something compelling and human and repeatable and something that moves their business. And so I think, humor is very often, and by the way, we make humorous skills. It's not saying there's not a place for that, but it's just saying, voice is this new thing that really requires you to live in it, because it's so easy to make bad, clunky work without even trying, if you're not really being thoughtful in your approach.
And there is a fair amount of substandard stuff out there as well. I think we've experiencing and trying and exploring these platforms. There is some really good stuff, and there's some kind of subpar stuff. But
yeah, and it's funny to me, because when you think about just in larger culture, they're sort of in the attention economy, if there was such a thing. It seems like there's no middle class. What I mean is, in traditional advertising, say everything's fast, everything's on a Twitter or an Instagram feed. You got fractions of a second to get attention. Okay, that's true. But you know what else is true? People will binge watch Netflix for 12 hours, and they say the enemy of Netflix is sleep. And so you realize that if you get a little bit of an attention, if you can break that threshold, you get all of it. And that's what the market, if you will, is giving us. And so to your point about a lot of substandard skills, there's a lot. I think the average is 2%. Something like this, re-engagement, not great. That's not true of ours, humbly. That Dunkirk skill had 70% re-engagement. And to us, we found that threshold that says, we're giving you something, we're making something that's worth your time. And we hit that inflection point where people were coming back. They were checking out the new sections that were opening. They were seeing what was possible within it. It invited play and exploration. And so, I think it's one of those things, is that we have to figure out, yes, there's barriers to this tech, but when you can break that threshold, you get all of the attention. And it's qualitatively different than, again, a Twitter feed, a website, even a YouTube video. And it's something that's really powerful, I think, from an affinity standpoint with brands,
Cool. So we've kind of started venturing into the kind of engagement and the creation and the team formation side of stuff. So maybe let's kind of venture a little bit further forward, and let's kind of imagine that there's a brand that's approaching Rain. What's the kind of process that you would take a brand through that kind of approaches you and says, look, we really want to explore this voice thing, whether they come to you and say, I want an Alexa skill, or whether they're just saying, look, I think we can really help us. What's the sort of general process as you kind of take a brand through, presumably the discovery and all that stuff, to creation and all that? What's the kind of broad sort of process?
Why don't I take the upfront, and Jason, maybe take the back part of this.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, something again. Very often when the phone rings, it is a lot of people already have an idea, and that's not a bad thing, by the way. We love those phone calls, but again, we want to try to help them discipline that thought. And so before we start just coding or creating or coming up with whatever, we actually start by looking at three things: one, business drivers; two, consumer truth; three, ecosystem. Business drivers. What is it that moves your business? I mean, we mentioned earlier in Campbell's what it was. With Dunkirk, what moves their business? Opening weekend. That is the most important date possible. So when you look at all of the content and the cadence of that content, it was backed up from that date. Everything shareable was backed up to that date, and we saw and we're starting to figure out attribution of how many people shared. Can we draw an attribution to ticket sales based on shares? So, really wanting to make sure that this thing is moving your business, whether it's an entertainment or a straight up CPG skill. Consumer truths, who are we talking to and what are their need states? And of course, the ecosystem. Do you have the tech to support it? What do we need to build? What exists? What can we leverage? And then when you find an overlap of those things, then we start saying, okay, now we can go and make this thing. Campbell's dinner solved. That everything is solving dinner. And so that's really the approach. And so we actually have an audit process wherein we come and investigate those three areas, as well as conversational mining. This is something that I think is something unique to Rain, I believe, where we have various segmentation around what consumers are saying to various devices. We're starting to build some patterns around that, as well as looking at their ecosystem as it currently sits and figure out where are conversations happening and how can we start to group those things together. So that's basically the first phase, is to figure out what's the result of those three areas of research, what conversations are happening, and then that takes us to our second phase where we start to synthesize those findings, we find that strategic territory, and then lastly, we start to define the short, near, and long-term implications. Short term, make an action around this. Near term, we need to start to build out your website to account for voice search. Long term, we need a content hub that does X, Y, and Z. Here's a VCOM play. Here's a native integration into your app. And then each of those have their own playlist as well. So too long didn't read of that. You start with strategy, and then you start to back into the creative from there. Anything to add to that, Jason?
Yeah, I'd just say when we do that, what that gives us as a team that's going to actually kind of build these executions on the platform, what that gives us is a lot more than just kind of a concept or a user story. What that gives us is a really well-defined target to be able to hit and build. So of course, our development team will build user stories based on the kind of experience that we're going to build. But if we're looking at, the roadmap down the road and we're saying, gosh, you're putting a lot of content into this skill. How are you going to manage the second or third version? How is this content going to interact with your website? Do you need a CMS, that's either, feeding the skill or on top of this skill? That impacts the way that we build from day one. Even if we don't build with the CMS, at go, that impacts the kind of analytics that we build into it and where we measure interactions. And that builds the kind of things that our voice designers will spend emphasis and time on. If they know that a particular part or interaction of the skill kind of like moves the business, well, then let's spend time and energy there. And if there's another part that is, less important or impactful, but something that maybe, we feel like we need to have for the platform, okay, let's do a good job at getting to the kind of par there, but, not put as much emphasis on this. So it really kind of tells us as a development team and as a voice creation process, what are the levers and the places that we need to pull and spend time and energy on. And so we have a really, really good idea of what we're doing. And I think that's a kind of a luxury that we get when we start with strategy, that a lot of other kind of places that just go in and tackle this from just a development standpoint. Okay, let's go build something in a dev shop standpoint. They really have to spend a lot of energy spinning their wheels at the beginning, and we don't have to.
So you mentioned there in terms of, there's a few interesting points there. One of them in terms of like, from the strategy standpoint, thinking about it not as a skill that you're going to launch and forget, but the discussion you are having there is very much around what are you going to do with this thing when it's live, and what are you going to do with version 2, 3, and 4. Is that kind of how early you would have that conversation? Is very much at the beginning in terms of where do you see this thing going in the future and how are you going to be able to manage it?
Absolutely, yeah. It's become for us a standard of we don't build a kind of a version 1 of something without an idea of what version 3 looks like. And for sure, that's a kind of a living conversation that happens with brands along the way. And we'll test and learn as we put something in market and see how it responds and how people interact with it. And that'll inform kind of the next versions, and those are flexible things. But we think about it in terms of kind of what's a crawl, walk, run of versions of these skills, and where can we begin to kind of test some hypothesis at a very early stage, and then how can we build on that so that by version 2, 3, and 4, we've got, something that is really kind of meaningful and impactful on the market and to the business, and that's a really kind of robust and sophisticated experience, or that's really sophisticated in terms of how it interacts with the owned website or CRM or something like that. So even if we're not building all of that day one at launch and people are kind of getting their feet wet into it, for sure that roadmap exists, and it's something that we revisit throughout the process collaboratively with the client.
That's fantastic. That's really interesting. That. And then, Will, you were mentioning there around you'll be having these conversations, and then one of the things that kind of struck me was conversation mining. So, but with that, are you talking about kind of like looking at other skills that you've got and figuring out what people are talking to and what's working, or are you talking about using other data points from elsewhere? Presumably it's an insight gathering thing, but where are you kind of pulling them conversations from, and what are you looking for?
Yeah, that's a great question. The first, it depends on the company we work with. For sure, we're doing comparative data from skills, no doubt about it. And we're figuring out what are the phrases, how long, things like this. We also have a product called Reverb, and Reverb has around 750,000 some odd followers. And we're getting some segmentation data. It's not a silver bullet. It's not fully matured, but it's one helpful data point. You start to figure out what are the behaviors of certain segmentation as well. But then also looking at a given organization. And it's amazing to us how much conversational stuff people already have. In the case of Campbell's, they had a 1-800 number for years around people calling and having conversations around dinner. And it was all recorded. And so you're able to go through that and mine that stuff and start to group it into categories and say, gosh, what are the issues around dinner? Well, time, taste, nutrition, simplicity. These are the education levels that people are at when they're asking. This is how they think about it. These are the types of recipes that have the most problems. All this kind of stuff. They actually had a lot of that, as well as looking at conversational places within an ecosystem. So things that seem out of date now, but things like mommy blogger comment pages, there's a conversational nature to that. There's a back and forth to that. So it's really looking at all of these different data points together and starting to figure out these are the conversations that these people are having, and we need to account for those. But it's really different for every brand. I mean, for sure, brands though that have 800 numbers and things like that, that is such an untapped gold mine, because you're literally talking to your consumer in a real way. But yeah, it just depends on the company for sure.
And yeah, that's fantastic. And then, so what happens then after that? What can the brand expect when they're working with Ray? And you've done that kind of upfront bit, you've done a bit of kind of strategic analysis, and you've done the conversation mining, you've had a bit of a think about where this thing's going to end up. Presumably you've arrived at a use case. What's the situation after that? How does it play out?
So then for each of the outputs, that third phase we have what's called a define phase. And so from there, we start to define those opportunities. Do you need a skill? Do you need an action? Here's, your voice commerce play. Here's a native integration. Here's your SEO strategy. Here's your voice SEO strategy, et cetera. And then we start to build out roadmaps for those products. When you think of something like voice SEO, tends to be a little bit of a bigger pool. Very often you need technical sort of considerations, you need tagging considerations, and very often you also need content to populate it that's written in a certain way, that's targeted, and all this kind of stuff. So typically that has a little bit longer roadmap than something like, a skill or an action. And so we really try to come up with roadmaps for each of those outputs and put scopes against each of those. Jason, anything to add to that?
No, just to kind of one of the other, in terms of building skills, or building kind of, whether it's on Alexa or Google Home, building these kind of conversational engagements. From there, the place that we kind of end up after that design, or after that that third phase there, is we really have a hypothesis around concepts that we want to be able to test. And so when we enter into, okay, how are we going to actually flesh this out into a VUI, or how are we going to actually build a skill or an interaction around that in this specific case? And that's not the only, output of where we go in and ask, but that's, obviously an output. So when we look at that, we really kind of begin with, okay, what are some kind of concepts and hypotheses that we can begin to test around what we know to be a core business driver? So if we know that, recipes are driving sales for our business, what are, 2 or 3, 4 hypotheses that we can begin to test in and around that for how we think consumers are likely to engage with your brand on this platform in this way in order to meet that end. And then from there, we kind of work with the brand to really define and test and pull and interrogate those concepts to make sure that we really landed on something so that by the time that we get to the next phase, which is really, okay, let's actually begin to plan out what this conversation is going to look like on the platform, we really have a lot of very strict guardrails for how that concept is going to go down. What are the kind of the conversational endpoints? What are the goals for a conversation? I think both from a kind of creative exercise in terms of the copy that's written and how, Alexa or Google is going to give voice and guide that conversation. But while we're planning that, where's the end game for this? If the beginning is, hello, welcome to the skill, what is the third interaction? What's that point that we're supposed to end up on? And then so from there, we can actually have a really, really well-defined process to then go in and build those conversations out, and then we take and, engineer and build and dev out and test and all that kind of good stuff.
Mm-hmm. And so when it comes to testing concepts, and this is something that I think is really important for anybody looking at doing this kind of stuff. I think people tend to get an idea, and then that's their idea, get wedded to it, and then go for it, and then that's kind of it. You know what I mean? Whereas, what kind of in terms of the user experience design sort of field, and obviously in voice as well, it's all around coming up with ideas and then testing it and figuring out which one's the right one. So how do you go about doing that without kind of building a skill and launching it, or how do you actually go about validating those ideas?
Yeah, I think we use a lot of, if we're building a software product online, kind of the analog to this would be a lot of like paper prototypes. And so we'll do a lot of those type of exercises just to be able to get 2 or 3 kind of steps down the process of building out a concept without having to invest all of that time and energy in what may be an excellent direction, or it may not be a good direction. And we need to know that before we begin to actually, put code down or build a conversation. So we'll do, things like writing out scripts and then ask, questions internally to ourselves or with the brand of, do these scripts sound right? Does this tone feel right? Does the where this conversation is leading feel right? We'll sit down across from tables from each other and, okay, you be Alexa, I'll be the consumer. We'll script it out and we'll talk it and we'll run through it. We'll do, scripted demos and kind of play them and say, okay, how did that interaction go? So it's building from a lot of what we know as good like UX or VX kind of standpoints to be able to validate designs before having to build them. So that's typically kind of the approach that we take. And we find that that's a good balance of getting to approximate what these ideas are going to look like if we actually built them, to be able to know, okay, do we want to go through the effort of building, that specific concept or idea?
Yeah, and I would also say that, as is the case of all digital, so again, a bit of an obvious statement here is not, well, we're done and now it's up and it's live and we can now go home. It's no, we have to continue to listen to it and iterate on it. And I think that very often, that's really where, because we usually do so much work on the upfront to figure out what's that strategic territory, we're usually going to be right in some way. We're usually not going to be in left field somewhere. And very often it's, okay, let's put this experience out there. And then we say, oh, here's this emergent behavior that happened. Or, ooh, these are the things that people thought this could do, but didn't. Or, oh, this is how they felt about this. I think qualitative QA is as important as quantitative in voice. Quant tells you what happened, but qual tells you why it happened and how they felt about it and puts empathy on it. And so as we start to iterate, we can start to get those more human factors into the software. And so I think we're constant, and that also, by the way, I think is one of the challenges with the way that a lot of brands sort of approach voice is a lot of brand, and we get it, but it's very often a one-off isolated innovation play with no idea as to how to iterate on it, one, and two, no real roadmap of how to integrate it into their larger ecosystem. And I think the unfortunate byproduct of that posture is, one, you end up not making the best product, A, and then more importantly, B, very often you'll have brands say, well, gosh, voice didn't really work for us. Well, no, it's a system thing. It's a product just like anything else, and you have to live and breathe it and iterate on it. And so, I think that, but trying to keep that human eye on this technology is such an important part for us in our QA and ongoing life cycle of the product.
And there's a piece just before that. So we've kind of discussed the discovery. We've discussed I think that the development side of stuff. We'll maybe have a bit of a talk about Voxer in a sec briefly. But I think there are a lot of listeners to this who are kind of they're kind of probably comfortable with some of the development side. One of the big things before you can do that kind of analysis afterwards in terms of what's working and what's not is getting people to actually use it. So, I mean, this might not be as much of a problem for you guys because you're working with some of the world's biggest brands, but what do you recommend people to do to get their sort of skills or actions sort of discovered and used so that they can have that data to improve it?
I can take that. Sorry, Jason, I was waiting. It looked like you were about to say something.
Sorry, I should have directed that one there. I'm just...
No, it's all good. Sorry. Skype it out. But I mean, we know that discoverability is a challenge with voice, but honestly, it's been a challenge really for the App Store, for iTunes. I think Spotify's rise is a direct result of iTunes' lack of an ability to do meaningful discovery. This is a industry-wide challenge, and I think the invisible nature of voice amplifies that already known problem by a lot. That being said, back to the win at voice, you think in systems, there's some no-brainer, no-duh stuff that helps solve that immediately. In the case of Campbell's, you pick up a soup can, guess what's on the back? Campbell's Kitchen, and so there's a natural discoverability there. We did paid amplification around it. When we work with brands too, and by the way, not all brands we work with are these giant Fortune whatever companies. Some are a little scrappier, and with them, we do, it's important to also look at what is the landscape look like within the skill store or within the action store. If you're trying to make a skill that 1,000 other people have already made and they've done well, you're probably not going to win there. And so what we try to do is figure out what's that white space that you can start to put your skill in. And a good example of this, I have to go back to Tide just because it's a good example of discoverability and also the skating to where the puck is going. On the first day, you had to say, Alexa, tell Tide I have a stain. We all know that is not necessarily the best experience. I have to remember all those things, and that's not a natural way to talk. But of course, we knew on day one that couldn't possibly be the case forever. And of course, now today, that's not the case. Now you can say, Alexa, I have a stain. And she can say, well, I have a skill. It's Tide. And because we are the best ranked in that certain category, we're getting that organic recommend traffic over and over and over again. And so that's a lot of, when it comes to discoverability, that's another part of it. Are you trying to operate in a flooded space? Or if nobody's there, that might be a really good opportunity for you to actually be able to capture that with a skill. So there's a lot of factors there, but I think in general, it's the same way if you put an app on the App Store. Just because it's there doesn't mean they're going to come to it. You have to put eyeballs on it, and so a sort of owned, earned, and paid approach is a right practice here as well, we believe.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. Well, guys, I think we've got a little bit of time left, but I think we've kind of covered absolutely all sorts in that. Is there anything that we've missed out there in terms of the process? So we covered the beginning bit, the strategy bit, and the discovery through to the development. On the development, let's just back up just for 1 second, because let's just tell us a little bit about Voxer. We haven't really covered a great deal about Voxer. So what's Voxer and how does it kind of work?
Absolutely, yeah. So Vox is an internal tool that we've built that we've made open source, so developers can use it. And essentially what it is it's a framework to be able to build skills easily and quickly, and to be able to kind of take advantage of all of the affordances of new features on the platform. So, when the show came out, we were updating Voxa to be able to have support for that new interface. So we find that especially because we're developing a lot of skills over and over again, or a lot of skills, that we need to be able to have some kind of efficiencies so that we're not creating everything from scratch. So this framework allows us to really build rapidly and quickly. And the other thing that it does is it really helps us to be able to leverage building one conversation and then being able to launch that in multiple channels. So Vox is an open source framework that allows developers to build a conversation, and they can build that kind of agnostically of what platform that's going to be launched on. So you can build one code base and then launch that on, Amazon. You can launch it on Google. You can launch it on Cortana, and we'll be adding more as the market sees adoption there. So it's really a really quick, easy tool to be able to get in and to build these skills and to build them well, and to be able to build them in a tested environment, to be able to take advantage of new features. It's got plugins for analytics so that you can plug it into your favorite analytics tool and use that. It's got plugins for databases so that you can be able to save and interact with any kind of like user memory that you want. So it's just a really kind of quick and easy tool to be able to get in for developers to build.
So you actually use it. It's not just a tool that you've built for developers. This is actually what you use to create this stuff as well, then.
Absolutely, yeah. And there are a couple other open source frameworks on the market as well. Even people that we're friendly with and talk to, and they're building their software, we're building ours, and kind of a rising tide carries all ships approach. But this is not just something that we have built for the market or have built for developers, but we use it in all of our branded skills as well. So humbly, I think I'd say it's not the only framework out there, but it represents one of the more mature ones, and for sure the most kind of production hardened ones, and it's seen the most use from the biggest brands on the platform with the most engagements. And so there's a lot of just reliability there on it.
Fantastic. So where can if there's brands listening to this interested in getting involved in Rain, or if they want to just kind of keep on top of what's happening at Rain and learn a little bit more about what you're all up to, what's the best way for people to either reach out to you guys or to get in touch or to kind of follow you all online?
Yeah, you can reach us at our website, rain.agency, not .com, just .agency.
Cool
I guess we'll
URL.
in the future that way.
Yeah.
Our newsletter, though, is something that if you're really interested, we really put a lot of thought into that. So you can sign up there, and we really try to keep people aware of sort of what's now and next with voice. So we encourage people to do that. And if you want to reach out directly, you can get us at hello@rain.agency, and we'll shoot you a note back.
Fantastic. Will, Jason, thank you so much for joining us. That was absolutely incredible conversation. I think we got into supreme detail in all kinds of areas there. That was absolutely immense. Thank you both so much for joining us. Really, really appreciate it.
Hey, Kane, thanks for having us. We really enjoy it. We're a fan of what you're doing, and happy to chat anytime. Yeah.
Absolutely.
That was Will Hall and Jason Herndon. Wow, that was an intense conversation. That was absolutely phenomenal. I know we've gone over the typical hour that we tend to do sometimes, and that's typically because we just have such an engaging conversation that it's just, you can't stop it. It's just free flowing. It was just absolutely inspiring. I think that there's bags and bags and bags of insight for brands and individuals and designers and developers and hobbyists and anybody who's even remotely interested in making this voice thing work for them or their business. Tons and tons of insights in there. Rain Agency are up to some amazing stuff, and everything that we've discussed today around the strategy, figuring out your strategy first, I think is hugely important, and the upfront work you need to do to figure out something that's going to benefit your business and add to whether it's increasing sales, whatever it is that makes your cogs turn. Creating something that links in directly with that, I think is a absolute no-brainer. The other thing I really liked was the systems thinking approach, in terms of not just having a voice skill or action that sits over here in some kind of weird black box that you need to treat as a separate entity, but actually how can you link that with the systems that you currently have. And then inevitably, as soon as you start peeling back that onion and you start peeling back the layers of organizational culture and tech, you realize that there's a lot more work to be done than just building a skill. How do you have your whole kind of organization systems talking to each other and then plug your voice interface or your voice capability into that technology? I think is obviously a challenge, but a hugely exciting one. Yeah, an absolutely fantastic conversation. Thank you, Will. Thank you, Jason, for joining us. Thank you all for listening, and until next time, see you later.